Kingston Pen. It's a place hundreds of inmates were desperate to get out of, an ominous place reserved for the worst of Canadian convicts.
In the quiet city of Kingston, Ontario, beside the cold, restless waters of Lake Ontario, stands a fortress of stone. Walls so tall they cut the wind, gates so heavy they seem to breathe. For almost 2 centuries, this place was a world apart. Locked away, forgotten, a place where Canada sent its darkest souls, and sometimes just broken ones. This is Kingston Penitentiary, old, brutal, and feared across the Western world. Since 1835, the sound of iron doors slamming and boots echoing down narrow halls became the rhythm of misery. Inside, men lived, died, vanished, not buried in graves, but in silence. What started as a dream of reform twisted fast into something darker. Control, cruelty, consequence. The kind that doesn't just scar skin, it scars the soul. In this story, we walk through those same cold halls. We see how it began, the horrors it held, the riots that tore it apart, and the moment it finally fell. Because what happened here isn't just Canadian history, it's human history. A story about justice and revenge, mercy and madness. Welcome to Kingston Penitentiary, a place that tried to bury its past but never really could. 1. Born from harsh justice, 1835 to 1900s. The story begins in the early 19th century, back when the word rehabilitation hardly meant anything. Canada was still trying to figure out who it was, still raw, still building itself. And crime, well, crime wasn't seen as a mistake. It was seen as sin. Then came 1835. Kingston Penitentiary rose from the ground like a stone beast, staring over Lake Ontario. Long corridors, thick limestone walls, tiny cells where a man could barely stretch his legs. Lawmakers said it was a place for reflection, for repentance. But truth be told, it was never about mercy. It was about control. Silence was the rule. No talking, no glancing at another soul, no name, just a number, striped uniforms, shaved heads, blank eyes. Every morning they marched, same steps, same noise into the workshops, stone cutting, weaving, carpentry, all under the sharp eyes of guards who wanted only one thing: obedience. The goal wasn't to teach, it was to break. Even the walls seemed to listen. Long halls echoed every footstep, and those narrow windows let in just enough light to remind a man what he'd lost. Kingston wasn't just a prison, it was an experiment in punishment, a reflection of how a new country tried to shape morality through fear. The government called it reform. The men inside called it something else, a slow, quiet death of who they were. 2. Brutality and abuse. As the years rolled on, the whole idea of reform started to fall apart. The mask slipped, and what was underneath wasn't pretty. Stories of beatings, torture, and mind games began to leak through the cracks. Guards ruled with fear, a wrong glance, a whispered word, even a breath out of place, punished. By the mid-1800s, the truth couldn't hide anymore. In 1848, an investigation called the place a pit of cruelty and moral rot. But nothing really changed. Solitary confinement became the weapon of choice. A box with no window, no light, no sound. Just time stretching forever. Some men came out broken, whispering to themselves like ghosts. Others never came out at all. Whippings with the cat-o'-nine-tails, starvation diets, iron restraints. It was all routine. Medicine was a joke. Pain was policy. They said suffering made the soul pure. But that was just a lie to make the screams easier to ignore. Still, behind those walls, truth began to stir. Prisoners started writing. Tiny letters, smuggled notes, scraps of confession. They told of men collapsing in the yard, of guards swinging nightsticks like they were nothing, of winters so cold breath froze on the walls. Kingston, once called a place of discipline, had turned into a house of torment. The silence they used to force, it wasn't discipline anymore, it was surrender. Years passed. Generations of men lived and died waiting for change that never came. Even the guards, some of them started cracking too. Guilt followed them home. The screams never left. The walls were thick, sure, but not thick enough to silence what they'd done. Third, riots and violence. By the 20th century, the world outside had changed. Cities grew, laws evolved, people dreamed bigger. But inside Kingston, time just stopped. The air felt heavy, the walls older, the silence thicker. Overcrowded cells, rotten food, endless isolation. It was a pot waiting to burst. The 1950s brought whispers of rebellion, little sparks of defiance. But then came 1971, the year Kingston burned its name into history. It started small, just another protest over living conditions. But within hours, chaos took the throne. Guards were taken hostage, cells went up in flames, and for 4 long days, the inmates ruled the stone beast. Smoke rose over Lake Ontario, black and bitter, a sign of rebellion no one could ignore. Negotiations broke down, fear gripped everyone. Every choice felt like a death sentence. And when it finally ended, 2 inmates were gone forever. Their short-lived freedom turned to ash. The riots shook the nation awake. Canadians, once proud of their justice system, were forced to stare into its cracks. How could one of the country's most secure prisons collapse into madness? The answer was simple: neglect. Years of silence, years of warnings buried under paperwork. These men weren't just violent, they were voiceless. And when voices are crushed long enough, they scream. After that, the government promised change. Reforms, new policies, better conditions. The usual talk. But inside Kingston, it still felt the same. The scars of 1971 clung to the walls, to the guards' eyes, to the trembling hands of men who had seen too much. The smell of smoke never really left. The legend of Kingston grew darker. No longer just a prison, but a wound that refused to heal, a symbol of rebellion, pain, and the price of forgetting humanity. 4. Living conditions and modern pressure. By the early 2000s, Kingston Penitentiary was barely alive. Just a ghost, crumbling and tired, standing on the edge of history. The old stone walls still looked strong from the outside, but inside, it was falling apart. Cells so small you could touch both walls without stretching. 1 bed, 1 toilet. That's it. In winter, frost crept over the walls like veins of ice. In summer, the smell hit you first. Sweat, rust, despair. The place was way over capacity, hundreds more men than it was ever built for back in the 1800s. Pipes burst, lights flickered. Rats didn't even bother hiding anymore. Human rights groups started shouting, and the world listened. Inhumane, they said. Outdated. Harsh words for a country that prided itself on compassion. Even the guards looked broken. Tired eyes, short tempers, underpaid and scared. You could feel it. The tension, the exhaustion, like the whole place was holding its breath. Then came the cameras. Documentaries, journalists, reporters, all digging into what had been hidden for decades. The world finally saw what Kingston had become, a decaying relic that no longer belonged in a modern society. Politicians started squirming. The costs were insane. Millions every year just to keep a dying building on life support. New prisons focused on rehab, education, a second chance. But Kingston, it was still stuck in the age of punishment. By 2012, the truth couldn't be ignored anymore. The government had a choice to make: cling to a piece of history or finally show some humanity. And everyone knew, deep down, the end was coming. 5. The closure. In April 2012, the Canadian government announced what many had long expected. Kingston Penitentiary would close. The reasons were clear. Skyrocketing costs of maintaining a crumbling facility. Failure to meet modern safety and human rights standards. And above all, a changing vision of justice. The closure didn't happen overnight. It was slow, almost painful, like watching an old giant take its final breath. One by one, inmates were moved out, sent to newer prisons with real plumbing, heat, even mental health programs. Things Kingston never truly had. Guards who'd spent their whole lives walking those stone corridors stood there, quiet as the cells emptied. Some didn't say a word. What could they say? On September 30th, 2013, the last iron door slammed shut, echoing through the halls one final time. For the first time in 178 years, Kingston Penitentiary went silent. Outside, the people of Kingston felt it. Strange, heavy. The prison had always been there, a shadow in the city's heart, part of its story. And now it was just gone. Inside, the air stood still. Dust hung in the light. The same halls that once rang with shouting, chains, commands. Now nothing but silence. When those gates finally locked for good, it wasn't just a building closing, it was the end of an era. The end of a belief that punishment alone could fix the broken. Canada was moving on, towards something gentler, maybe wiser. But for the men and women who lived and worked inside those walls, the memories didn't leave. They stayed, like ghosts that refused to be forgotten. 6. What happened after? After 2013, Kingston Penitentiary got a strange kind of second life, not as a place of punishment anymore, but as a museum of its own ghosts. The government turned it into a national historic site, and for the first time, regular people could walk through the gates that once held Canada's most dangerous men. What they saw stopped them cold. The narrow corridors, the rusted bars, the old graffiti carved into walls. It was like time had frozen. In 2016, guided tours began, led by former guards who knew every scream, every riot, every secret. They spoke of escapes in the night, of men who lost their minds in solitary, and of rare moments of kindness that somehow survived the darkness. Visitors stood in the isolation cells, stared at the execution area, and felt something heavy. 2 centuries of pain pressing down in silence. Kingston soon became a magnet for filmmakers too. Documentaries like Inside Kingston Penitentiary and Secrets of the Pen drew millions, all captivated by this uneasy mix of horror and history. In a way, this was Kingston's redemption. Not to erase the past, but to face it. Yet even now, not every door is open. Some rooms stay locked, maybe for good. Too many stories, too much pain. People who visit still talk about it. That strange feeling, that chill, like the place is still alive. Kingston doesn't hold prisoners anymore, but it holds their ghosts, and maybe it always will. 7. Why it still matters today. Kingston Penitentiary doesn't stand for shame anymore. It stands as a reminder, a monument carved from mistakes, change, and time. Those old stone walls, once built to break men, now tell a different story. One about how far Canada has come and how far it once fell. For almost 2 centuries, Kingston mirrored the country's soul. It started in darkness, when pain was called justice, and ended in something softer, an awakening maybe. But its story still makes you think, doesn't it? How much suffering is ever enough in the name of order? Can a person really change if all they've ever known is punishment? And what happens when the system that's meant to protect becomes the one that destroys? The ghosts of Kingston still whisper those questions. They remind us that justice has to grow, that walls can't fix what's broken inside. Now tourists walk those same halls, hearing the echoes, feeling the chill, realizing history isn't just remembered, it's felt. Kingston's gates might have closed for good, but its lessons, they're still open. Lessons about cruelty and compassion, power and forgiveness, law and the fragile thing we call humanity. The iron doors may never swing again, but the echoes, they keep speaking. Always will. And for almost 180 years, Kingston Penitentiary was its own world. Sealed off, silent, unblinking. The walls saw everything. The world outside saw nothing. It was built from stone, sure, but what really held it together was fear. Cold, constant fear. And yet, even in that darkness, small sparks of humanity refused to die. A smuggled letter here, a shared piece of bread there, a friendship between men who were never meant to be friends, a guard who looked the other way, just once. When those gates finally shut in 2013, it wasn't just a building closing, it was a whole way of thinking ending. Canada was moving on, leaving behind the place that had once defined its harshest lessons. But if you stand there now, near the lake, when the wind cuts through the corridors, You can still hear it. The echo of boots on stone, the clang of iron, the ghosts breathing. Kingston Penitentiary is gone, but not really. It's still part of us. A reminder carved deep into the country's conscience that justice without humanity isn't justice at all. It's just another kind of prison. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten histories, dark legacies, and the voices time tried to silence. Because some stories deserve to be heard again.